So let's just do a really brief recap of the four opponent powers. I thought I would throw that in there as well, simply because as we go through these verses, if you are finding things coming up for you that you go, okay, this is what's happening in my life, this is what I must have done to create the causes for that. Making a determination to do something different is certainly part of what we're looking at in this course. But another aspect of the teachings on karma is to purify that negative karma that we've created, to recognize that, as I said earlier, that fourth aspect of karma, or characteristic of karma, that unless something is done that interrupts it, it will create its result. So if we've done something negative and we recognize that we've got that experience in our life that has to be coming from that, well then we, through the kindness of the Buddha, have this process that we can engage in called purification. And it's usually set out with these four R's: regret, reliance, remedy, resolve. It's just easy to remember that way, but there are different names that you'll see for these. And this is the order that I usually teach these in, very similar to, I think, what Venerable Rabina teaches them in, the same order. And the first one, regret, isn't guilt. It's not feeling horrible about ourselves because we did these things. If we have these particular things going on in our lives, we might think, oh, must have been a horrible person. How did I create such awful karma? And then we put ourselves down. Well, that's not what it's about. It's about saying, okay, I created it. I'll take responsibility for it. Meaning we just simply own it. Through the force of our ignorance, as we were in response to Adam's question earlier, when we, just like many beings, are completely ignorant of karma. And maybe even our own understanding of karma right now is not as great as it should be. But at least we have the awareness now. So if we recognize that we were under the control of that ignorance, just doing things without any understanding, thinking that we were acting in our own best interest when we were actually creating suffering, well, you're like the person who smoked cigarettes before they knew the dangers of cigarettes. Well, you just did it. You didn't, weren't trying to inflict harm on yourself, but you take responsibility then and stop smoking cigarettes when you realize how harmful they are. So it's very much that attitude. With regret, you want to regret the specific things that you recall doing, but also the more general things that you must know. For example, if we see things as we go through this and go, oh wow, I must have done that in the past because I've got that going on in my life, well then we can make that assumption. We've probably done just about everything there is to do. We've killed beings, we've stolen from them, we've done all kinds of harmful things. So that's just a way to work with regret. The second one is reliance, and that means that we need a support for purification. Reliance is twofold. It includes both the mind of refuge and the mind of bodhicitta. Refuge is where we generate that strong reliance upon the three jewels, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, as our support going forward, kind of renew our commitment to the Dharma, to practicing a path that is in line with all of these teachings. And then we also kind of repair our relationship with the Buddha by making a strong determination of refuge. Again, from the side of the Buddha, there's no hard feelings because we've gone against the Buddha's teachings, but we need to do that from our side to kind of realign ourselves with that. But then with other sentient beings that we've harmed, we need to also kind of repair the relationship to some degree. And that's why we generate bodhicitta. So refuge and bodhicitta are done together as part of this power of reliance, so that we restore our faith in the three jewels and we also restore our commitment to benefiting other beings. That we think, from now on, my mind is together with bodhicitta and I'm going to do everything possible to benefit others. Then, on the basis of that regret and reliance, we have to have an actual remedy. You have to do something that offsets that negative act that is a more positive act. Essentially, a remedy could be anything. There's, sometimes there's nice remedies that work quite specifically, like the story of the golf balls. I mean, it's a real specific remedy in a sense for someone to take responsibility for whatever harm they might have caused somebody else and do something to go over and actually try to repair that relationship. But we don't always have that opportunity to do something quite personal. But nonetheless, there are many virtuous acts that we can engage in. We can engage in certain practices, such as prostrations to the 35 Buddhas, or such as recitation of Vajrasattva mantra, or recitation of the Heart Sutra that we said earlier today. Any of these types of practices are really useful to create a counterforce to the negative acts that we've done. Because through our regret, this is what we're working with, these specific actions. Now I'm going to do a remedy that kind of blocks them from ripening into their full result. Of course, now the purification that's done through that remedy may weaken that seed, may get rid of that seed, but essentially, this is just the idea to kind of counteract it in some way, to lessen or to eliminate that negative act. That's the third one. A remedy, as I said, can be any virtuous act. You could make a donation to a charitable cause if you're pairing it up with this process of the opponent powers, and it would be equally effective because it's you doing something virtuous with a good intention to offset the negative act that you did. Then resolve is, they say, the most important, and that's where you actually make the determination not to do it again so that we don't keep creating the causes of our own suffering. That's a bit of what we see even in these verses that we're going to look at, is there's a bit of that idea that, okay, I've got to stop doing this from now on and do something different. So the advice that's always given when we talk about resolve is to work with what's comfortable for you. If you have particular actions, thoughts, whatever that you're trying to stop that you know can't be stopped just by saying, I'm not going to do that again, then don't say, I'm not going to do that again. Say, I'm not going to do that again for some period of time. Give yourself some leeway in terms of working with that in a more gradual way. But make some determination at the end of that practice that you're going to move in an opposite direction. You're going to do something that is not the same repetitive pattern. I don't know if there's any questions on what I've talked about then. Yeah, Adam.
So you mentioned Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. What exactly is Sangha, the last thing you mentioned?
So Sangha are technically those beings who are on the path of seeing or above. They've had a direct realization of emptiness or above. We call those Arya beings, A-R-Y-A. That's another Sanskrit word that means superior. They've got superior insight. Technically, that's what we mean by Sangha. That's who we really take refuge in, are those beings who've developed that level of realization and beyond. Sangha, though, as a word, gets used in a lot of different ways. Sangha, in some traditions, is mostly referring to the ordained Sangha, the members of a community that are ordained. So the Sangha jewel, those beings who are in that category of having those great realizations are kind of represented in the world by those who wear the robes, monks or nuns who are ordained. So in that way, we could call them Sangha as well. But then sometimes Sangha even gets used to refer to just the general community. Like we could call this a Sangha here at Jamyang, the Jamyang Sangha. And it just means then a community of practitioners. And that doesn't mean that everyone in this community is an Arya being or ordained. It just means that they're practicing together. And that's a very loose definition that's maybe not that traditional. I think that's more of a Western adaptation. So technically, it's beings with direct realization of emptiness. It could also refer to the ordained Sangha, the ordained members of a community. But then it can also be referring to the general community in a much looser way. I think the Vipassana groups often use this term. Like in Santa Fe, they have the Santa Fe Vipassana Sangha. And they don't mean that they're all highly realized beings. They just mean that they're a community that practices together. Okay. Yes. Amelia.
So, thanks. Reliance. Taking refuge. It seems to be such an essential aspect of being the Buddhist path.
Sure.
And well, it's just that once I heard someone mention that being a Buddhist, you could either, and it was used or, not and, either take refuge in the three jewels or believe and abide by the four seals. But it was an or. And that surprised me very much. Because I think, well, without taking refuge, Immediately this mind saw it as a contradiction,
Right.
having the or.
I don't know what to say to that. You'd have to talk to the person who said that. I'm not sure. I haven't heard that myself. The 4 seals are the 4 things that we say are anyone who's Buddhist would hold to those. That, all conditioned phenomena are impermanent, all contaminated things are suffering. Nirvana is peace. That's the final one. I'm sorry. Nirvana is peace. The third one is all things are selfless, all phenomena are selfless, and then selfless, all phenomena are selfless, and then nirvana is peace. It essentially gets at what does it mean to be a Buddhist by philosophy, by thought. What is it what's the Buddhist view? But if somebody's taking refuge but they don't have a Buddhist view, well then I'm not sure that they really understand what refuge is. So I'd say they're both involved. I'd have a hard time saying or myself.
Yes, so did I.
But also keep in mind, when we often talk about refuge as meaning that formal ceremony where one is in the presence of a master, of a preceptor, given something to recite and all of that. But refuge is also just what we do in our hearts, and it's a process. I like Lama Yeshe says, we don't take refuge, we do refuge. It's like that's what we're doing all the time, is just renewing our refuge by constantly relying on the 3 jewels. So it's not just a demarcation of a point in our path, it's rather a whole process of what we're always doing, deepening our refuge day in and day out. Yeah, were you going to say something, Steve? Oh, okay. So let's go into these verses, and about time. So just so you know, I'm starting what is session 3 of 12 sessions right now. So we are a little behind, because if we're going to do 4 sessions each day, I'm going to have to speed things up. But like I said, once we get into these and you kind of get the feeling for them, there might not be quite as much to say. So let's read this first of these verses. This is the first 3 lines. Whenever an intolerable ailment arises in our body, it is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for having inflicted harm on the bodies of migrating beings. Oops. Sorry. Okay, so we've got some very specific instruction here. That's once more the first line. This is what's happening. This is the result that you're experiencing. In this case, having an ailment in our body, some sort of illness. Getting that it's our karma is the second line. It's the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us. Like I said, one of the ways that this analogy of the wheel of sharp weapons is being used is that it's like something we're sending out through the force of our karma, and it's coming back around like a boomerang to hit us, to give us that suffering experience. So this is the first 2 lines in identifying what it is and that the fact it's our karma. The third is the why. What did I do to cause this? And of course, having harm caused to us on our bodies is by having inflicted harm on the bodies of others. It seems kind of obvious. So it's not to say that all of these are going to be equally obvious. There will be some where it's not quite as clear why that particular thing is happening. But this is, as I said, in the vein of the result that is similar to the cause in terms of our experience, because we have created that energy of harming the bodies of other beings. We are now having harm inflicted upon our own beings. We now have those ailments. By the way, one little piece of advice I want to give before we get too far into this came from the teacher I received teachings first from on this text, Venerable Lingongkar Tulku. He said, never take these trainings as seeing them in others, only see them in yourself. So we might have that habit when we go through this and say, oh, I know that's happening to so-and-so in my life. That's why that's happening to them. It can be useful to have that insight maybe to some degree, but that's not what this text is about. Like I said, this text is about putting the mirror to our own face and saying, oh, I've got that going on. What did I do to cause that to happen? To not become everyone else's kind of dharma therapist, figuring out what's all going wrong with them, but to use this to analyze ourselves, all right? So let's read the final line. Now we should willingly take upon ourselves all ailments without exception. So of course, this is a Mahayana approach to this, saying that this is the instruction to have that willingness to take on whatever ailments, whatever suffering is out there upon ourselves, to breathe in everyone's cancer, everyone's headaches, everyone's whatever, to have that kind of courageous attitude, to breathe everything in and give them our happiness, complete that full process of Tonglen, meditate on taking and giving in this way. Now, does this mean because we see this as the advice from Dharma Rakshita that we should still harm other beings? I mean, we're getting this karma from having inflicted harm on other beings. So maybe Dharma Rakshita is assuming it's a given that we're going to abandon harming other beings. And we just want to do this additional Mahayana practice. Because if we continually are cultivating the thought of taking on the harms of others, of course, that's going to protect us from harming them. Hopefully, we won't ever generate that mind. But moreover, it's going to make us much more responsive to the harm that others are experiencing, the ailments that they're having, and so on. Kind of open our hearts up with more compassion for them and their suffering. So this is, again, a Mahayana approach to this, how to work with this. One thing my teacher says in regard to this practice of Tonglen that, again, is said in this verse, as well as what you're going to be encouraged to do at the end of each of these verses, is that you can visualize, if it's useful for you, your own guru appearing in the form of whatever Buddha works for you. I mean, some people have particular Buddha preferences. Avalokiteshvara, Chenrezig, who's the Buddha of compassion, is a useful one to visualize because we're working with compassion, loving kindness, these kinds of qualities. But you can do that as part of this as well, kind of visualize that Buddha above you, kind of helping you, giving you the blessings and strength to be able to practice in that way, use them as inspiration. You can use Buddha Shakyamuni, you can use Lama Tsongkhapa, you can use Green Tara, you can use Jesus Christ, you can use whoever works for you. Doesn't really matter. Another thing that my teacher said was to make this into a bit of a long life practice too, that we can visualize breathing in all this suffering, and then we can think that the suffering even goes down into the ground to appease Yama, the Lord of Death. Like there's this idea that in Buddhist cosmology that Yama is in some realm like 7 layers below the earth or something. So you can think like this all opens up and all these negativities go down there and Yama gets very satisfied and kind of falls asleep. Let's see if I'll go to where he reads this. He used to teach on this occasionally in Italy, and it was always so funny, because when he said when he goes to sleep, he would fall back in his chair like that. He says here, all their sufferings and afflictions leave through the pores of their body in the form of black liquid. It descends 7 levels below the ground to where the Lord of Death abides in the hungry ghost realm. It goes into his open mouth and he swallows it, whereby he is completely filled and satiated and lies down to sleep. In this way, the taking and giving meditation can also become a long life practice. Again, it's all done at the level of visualization. There's no being that's called Yama that is the inflictor of death. It's all about kind of using this with that intention, that it kind of removes all the obstacles for our own good health and long life, as well as for that of others. So that's one of the verses. That gives an idea, again, of these 4 parts. And all the other verses we see through 45 are going to be kind of about a specific result. And then 46 through 48 are going to be more general advice on how to work with this. So is that clear? Yeah, Andres.
Why doesn't he say that we shouldn't harm others?
Yeah. Well, and I think it's twofold. What I was alluding to was maybe, first of all, maybe Dharma Rakshita is assuming that we're not going to harm others. I mean, because it's a Mahayana text and we're just kind of making the assumption that but I don't know if that's necessarily so. But the other thing was that I think if we do practice this advice, if we do practice taking on the sufferings of others, the ailments of others, then we're generating more compassion for them that will block us from having thoughts of harming them, ideally.
It depends.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I mean, there's no guarantees with this. This is why, again, developing these deep levels of compassion is quite a job. I mean, it's not easy to have compassion for all beings. Maybe easy to have for some people in our lives.
Slowness, where we said that
Yeah.
at least if you cannot benefit
Right, right. I mean, there would be no fallacy if Dharma-Rakshita had included it. I guess because it's a Mahayana text, he wanted to emphasize the taking practice, particularly here at the beginning. We are going to see some places where there's more specific things about, guided advice about how to deal with a particular difficulty. So I agree with you. He's maybe being a bit idealistic, thinking that we'll get that message right away. But yeah, Adam. Oh, the microphone. We've missed the microphone with Andras.
I'm just hoping you can repeat the step you said, that after each of the verses we should visualize our guru in the form of one of the Buddhas. Doing what exactly?
Well, they could be, above the crown of our heads as well as, above others. Just giving us that inspiration and blessing, because we're trying to move in the same direction that the Buddhas have already moved to. And so frequently in tantric practices in particular, you use an already enlightened being in some form that represents that energy in your life that you want to rely upon. And you think that your guru is appearing in that form to help you in particular. I mean, when we talk about these different forms of Buddhas, like the Buddha of Manjushri, who I mentioned earlier, who's the Buddha of wisdom, and then Chenrezig, who's the Buddha of compassion, and Green Tara, who is this enlightened activity, this energy of the Buddhas that gets things done and accomplished. It's not to say that they don't have any of the other qualities. It's just that's a particular quality that we know we need to work on. So if we're going to work on generating our compassion, well, then it might be useful to envision the Buddha who represents that fully developed compassion and seek the kind of guidance and blessings of that being to practice in this way. And you could even do a full practice of Chenrezig and visualize Chenrezig sending down rays of light that enter into you, that empower you to have the courageous mind of compassion to do this work. And you could do a very intricate thing, but he just suggests that, one thing is to visualize that above the crown of your head. He says, visualize the being above the crown of your head, then visualize that all sentient beings in the aspect of human beings are invoked into the space in front of you. From their right nostril comes black light and so forth, all their problems or ailments. It enters your left nostril, descends to your heart, then destroys your self-cherishing and so on. He doesn't say anything more about utilizing that meditational deity, but the point is that they can be a source of inspiration for us, and remind us of why we're doing this work, to achieve that result. So, okay. Let's read verse 11. Whenever suffering arises in our mind, it is definitely the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for having disturbed the mental continua of others. Now we should willingly take upon ourselves all their dukkha without exception. So he uses a very similar last line in this, kind of taking upon suffering. But here he uses the term dukkha. Dukkha, as you may know, is the word that the Buddha used to describe our situation in terms of our dissatisfaction that we experience, the fundamental unsatisfactory state that we find ourselves in, that includes the grosser forms of suffering, but also includes the fact that we never really have any real satisfaction even when we get what we want. But this verse in particular is mostly about mental suffering, as it says in the first line, when suffering arises in our mind. Obviously, when we're having physical suffering, it's also in our mind, but it's primarily in our body. That's what the previous verse was about, was when we have a physical ailment arising in our body. So this is more when we have a subtler level of dukkha, that is kind of our own mental distress or agitation or dissatisfaction, whatever might be going on, that we kind of see that that's because we've disturbed the minds of others through our own negative states, our own delusions, our own anger, frustration, what have you. So we should have that willingness once more to take upon ourselves all their dukkha without exception. And to stop disturbing the minds of others. As we saw with the previous verse, it didn't include that directly contradictory advice, but there's no reason why we wouldn't practice that as well. Why we wouldn't say, yes, I'm going to stop, upsetting the minds of beings around me. stop upsetting my parents or my children or my partners or my whatever. I mean, all the people that we have that we put through so much torment through our silly minds and the things we say and do on the basis of that. So again, the main training, as Geshe-la points out, is taking in both the previous verse and this verse, because we're working with this understanding of the suffering that's going on. The suffering that we're experiencing that is the same as the suffering of others, physically or mentally. As I said previously, we're not alone in that. Our individual situation might look different, but the fundamental taste of it is the same. Everyone else who feels distress or depression or whatever is feeling something very similar. So in this way, we can take that suffering that others experience upon ourselves, heap it on the self-cherishing mind, willingly transmute it into a path for opening up our hearts with compassion, and then once more, give to others everything that brings them peace of mind. Geshe Ngawang Dargye, in his commentary, included even in here our own breaking of any precepts or commitments that we've made, any vows that we've taken. This is also, in a sense, how we've upset the minds of our teachers in particular. Again, not that if they're Buddhas, they don't really have minds that can be upset in that way. They don't experience any distress at that happening. But we've kind of gone against what are the commitments we've taken from these beings that we want to uphold in our own lives. So he includes in there breaking any precepts that we've taken. But it's in general anything that we've done that has disturbed the minds, the mental continua of others. All right, let's go to the next verse, verse 12. Oh, mm-hmm.
Just a quick question. On the previous verses, I thought that the mind being disturbed was also. I thought that the mind being disturbed was also related to habituations. So let's say, being annoyed by noise for many past lives, and there is the habit of being frustrated, and then when it's just a matching pattern now, to just go straight into that.
Sure.
Not necessarily because of causing it to others, although that could also happen, but just as a result of habituation.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's certainly other things we would see as causes of why we have particular mental states. As we pointed out earlier, one of the karmic results we have is similar in terms of our behavior. So even if we have a particular mental pattern, why it ripens more frequently in our minds is because we've habituated ourselves to that. So it's not to say that there couldn't be other causes involved. And that's going to be something that comes up frequently in these verses. As I went through them, I was kind of like always going, really? I don't think that's what it said in the Lam Rim, because if we go back to Lam Rim teaching, sometimes they say quite specific things there too, in terms of why particular karmic results are occurring. But for this one, if we say, anytime suffering arises in our mind, there's definitely a karmic component of how much we've habituated to those states of mind. If we've sat there and maybe even had a mind that was very kind of critical of others and all of that, where we've got a mind that's always looking at other people's faults, well, that's a mind that we can get very habituated to, where we live our lives always finding faults in other people's minds, which isn't a very pleasant mind to have, because we don't end up connecting with others very genuinely. And is that due to having disturbed the minds of others? Or is that just due to just our having bought into a pattern of judgment and criticism? I mean, probably both. I guess, again, it's always hard for me to say when we look at these texts as to how definitive this is supposed to be, rather than just a suggestion from Dharma Rakshita of one way to look at it, to help us to identify the harm that we do cause to the minds of others. Because we, again, do it through our speech, we do it through our physical actions. We certainly are doing it with our thoughts that are behind all of that. So I agree with you. I think there can be other causes that we can look at and say, harming the bodies of others is certainly one way that physical ailments can arise in our body. I think it's probably one of the main ways, but there can probably also be other things that are involved. I don't know. I mean, I don't want, whenever I get into thinking about karma myself, I think there's a niceness to having it being that specific. But in other ways, we recognize that it can't be too specific, or it doesn't allow for the kind of flow of life and the various things that happen to us. So I don't know that we can be that definitive. They say a Buddha has that perfect knowledge through that omniscient mind to know exactly what happened, so that when you have a particular thing going on in your life, the Buddha could say, oh, this was due to the fact that 5 lifetimes ago this happened, and da-da-da-da. Be very precise about it. But for us, we just have to make these kinds of assumptions. So these is Dharma Rakshita giving us some general assumptions about how to work with experiences in our life. And that's my take on it, at least. But shall we continue? Let's recite verse 12. Whenever we are tormented by intense hunger and thirst, it is the sharp weapon of bad actions turning against us for having cheated, stolen, appropriated, and acted miserly. Now we should willingly take upon ourselves all hunger and thirst without exception. So we see that beings are like us in having these types of experiences when we have to go through some level of hunger or thirst. Intense hunger or thirst, I mean, I don't know. I guess some people do experience that in our lives, maybe not as much. Certainly in this world, definitely people. But I think that these causes that are set out are certainly involved in us not having resources in our lives. Again, the karma of around resources is that if we appropriate, steal, take the resources of others, then those resources don't ripen in our own lives, be they food, water, clothing, protection, whatever the case might be, money, all of these things. But again, that's one way that we experience that. What's interesting about this one is going back to your question about how personal is karma, this is one where Dharma Rakshita is saying, okay, we've cheated, stolen, appropriated, acted miserly with regard to specific situations, probably, specific beings, stolen from them and so on. But it's manifesting in terms of our own hunger and thirst, not those beings stealing from us. So it's again another little just iteration on it. I don't think these are meant to be, like I said, that definitive and specific, but rather giving us another way to think about some of these. Let me go to, maybe I didn't highlight that one. It's okay. I don't think Geshe-la says a whole lot more about this. So once more, Geshe-la just advises that we do Tonglen at the end of this. That was the last verse. Now we should willingly take upon ourselves all hunger and thirst without exception. Kind of thinking whatever we are experiencing, whatever others are experiencing, we gladly experience that ourselves. Put it on the self-cherishing mind and give all beings what we have that brings us happiness. That becomes instantly what they need for their happiness, to relieve their hunger, their thirst, to help them to have perfect happiness. So these verses, like I said, there's not a whole lot to say because they're relatively straightforward in terms of what the specific suffering is, what Dharma Rakshita is telling us is going on, what's behind it. So let's go on then to the next one, number 13. Whenever we are powerlessly exploited and tormented by others, it is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for having hated those who are inferior and treated them as slaves. Now we should use our body and life in the service of others. So this is an interesting one in terms of pointing out that there is a very similar cause behind this result. When we're feeling like people are taking advantage of us, like we're being exploited, like others are, even, it uses the word tormented, but in some way we're at a disadvantage. Well, that's because we've treated other people in an inferior way. We've kind of created that type of karma that causes them to experience what it's like that we're experiencing. So this is very much in line with that idea of that particular type of karmic result. The advice that we're being given, of course, we still would practice Tonglen, even though it's moving away from that specific advice about taking upon others' suffering and all of that. The specific advice is to use our body and life in the service of others, to practice humility, to practice being a servant of others. Venerable Thupten Chodron talks about Lama Yeshe, because she was a student of Lama Yeshe's at the beginning. She has her own organization now, Sravasti Abbey, and kind of is doing her own thing, but she's still quite connected to Rinpoche and Lama and the whole organization. But she said that Lama Yeshe said once, this should be your mantra, I am the servant of others, I am the servant of others. When he was talking to people in the FPMT and the Sangha in particular, that should be how we live our lives, is thinking that we're here to serve others. It's hard to live your life completely that way, that what others need, you're happy to help them to get, happy to be of service in that way. But I think there's some real benefit to having that type of mindset. I don't know that there's much more. Recall that they also put. Oh, this is the other side of it, is that if we have a situation like this, see, the other ones were where we just had a physical ailment or we had this kind of mental suffering, we got our hunger and thirst. It doesn't seem like there's other people inflicting any harm on us in those situations, right? These are things that, again, are forces that are just manifesting in our body, our mind, and so on. In this case, when we're being exploited and tormented by others, it's also really useful to think about those beings and what they're going to have to experience on the basis of that. Because here we are experiencing that result. We should have nothing but compassion for those beings, because they too are going to have to experience a similar result, because they are creating the causes just as we had created the causes. So I think that's another thing to add to this, to help you to get that sort of compassionate wish to benefit these beings, to practice Tonglen in relation to them, is to really feel that they are objects of our compassion because of these actions that they're engaging in. Another point that Venerable Rabin and I got into discussing on this, when this whole idea of karma being quite personal. So say somebody does do something that harms you in this way, and you don't harm them back. So you're not creating that personal karma with them any longer, of you being the exploiter and them being exploited, and then them being the exploiter and you being exploited. I mean, this is what we see in society around what we call a victim and perpetrator. And of course, because of not having the view of karma, we think that's kind of absolute, that this person was an absolute innocent victim and this person was an absolute guilty perpetrator. But because of karma, that perpetrator was a victim in another life and was the victim of the perpetrator who was now the victim. So it's like keeps going back and forth from perpetrator to victim. But if you withdraw from that, if you say, okay, I'm going to stop that cycle from me being involved with that being in that way, well then if karma is personal, then there's no way for them to experience that result from a person, because you won't ever be the person doing that for them, right? Does that make sense? You see what I'm saying? So if if Nat and I are caught up in something, and then I stop it, I say, oh, this is ridiculous, I shouldn't be doing this to Nat. Poor Nat, I'm making Nat's mind just incredibly agitated, so I have to remove myself from that. Well then, when Nat has that karma ripened to be harmed in that way, because you've created the causes, right? You were the one that was doing it in the first place. You've created the causes, but there's no one there to harm her, right? So then what do we do, And so there is that question about, well, what happens to karma that we create if there's no agent to reciprocate, if it is that personal? I don't know, these are the things I think about. Maybe I should stop thinking about them. But they do raise some questions about karma. And I guess you could say, well then maybe there's some inanimate force or some other way that karma is experienced. But Venerable Rabin and I, we got into a discussion about it, and it was quite animated simply because you do start examining it. And it's really unclear when you get down to that level, kind of get into the grasp, what's really happening with karma at that level. To what extent would somebody experience the result if the person who was involved in it, who created that karma with them, or they were the object of that karma, is no longer an agent playing that game? Well, then what happens? I mean, if they don't have to experience it, that would be wonderful. Then that's another reason why we can remove ourselves from harming others, because we're going to detach from that cycle, and then nobody experiences the results of the harm that they've caused me.
It's like Tonglen, isn't it?
Pardon?
Practical Tonglen.
Yeah, in a sense, you're helping them to not have the causes of suffering any longer, because you're willingly disengaging from that process. I mean, it sounds kind of strange, but I don't know. Again.
You also say or present the argument that, okay, so you've withdrawn from harming, causing this agitation at or whatever, so therefore you could say that the agent is no longer present for that in that situation, but then the cause is still there within that for their mind to be agitated by someone or something that will come in another way, in another form. So it's not as specific as you.
But if it is specific, then there can't be another person that harms that didn't create the causes.
But is karma really
That's the question. Yeah, I mean, I guess it just, again, these are some things that, they don't keep me awake at night. Don't worry about that. I'm not, lying there thinking about these questions, but it is worth, and why I bring these things up, maybe it's, there's some kind of interest that I have in exploring them with groups sometimes. But I also think it's important for us to examine these teachings ourselves and really see, well, where are the issues that we find with them? This is a lot of what we did in the master's program, was we'd sit around talking and just kind of see where there's gaps in our own understanding that we're not really quite sure. And you talk to some of the Tibetan lamas and they kind of say, oh, I don't know, and they say this or that, or sometimes they give an answer that's not even related to the question, and you kind of go, okay, well, that was interesting, but I'm not really sure I'm any closer to an answer. But I think it is important that we think about this, and this whole idea of if I do detach, and I stop being part of this cycle of harm involved with whoever, well then am I, in a sense, liberating them from having to experience these effects of their past action? It'd be wonderful, but maybe they will experience them in some other way.
I was going to say, that would be wonderful if that was the case,
Yeah.
because then it makes your action even more powerful than you perhaps might think it to be, because if that really is the case, then there's so much that you could do simply by changing, saying, look, I'm not going to do that because of that person, the potential suffering that they will get from that, and then it's all finished and done and dusted with that.
Right, that's the end of the line.
Like it would go much quicker.
Yeah. I don't know. Anyway, yes. Oh, Adam and then Emil.
I'll be quick. I was just thinking of a visual analogy to it, like Newton's cradle. The little metal balls that go like this. And so, if one of them is the cause or the effect, it's not really clear which one is the cause of the effect, depending on whichever one.
Which one starts?
But if you moved one out the way, or if you moved, then eventually it's just going to die out.
Right.
So it makes sense, I guess,
that if you extract,
one of the actors in this back and forth, then it's eventually just going to dissipate.
Yeah.
I mean, from my experience anyway, it seems like that's how it tends to play out.
Yeah.
Don, I hear you saying that, and what came to mind was the Me Too movement. So there was this guy doing a lot of harm, emotional, sexual abuse, and all of it. And then they just decided to stop it, actually stopping him to continue doing such harm. But maybe, well, what do I know? Maybe perhaps stopping, but without feeling hate and anger towards him, to really having forgiveness in their hearts. So stopping him from doing any further harm, but at the same time, if they go with hate and wishing him to be really unhappy and so on, that may actually, create the situation to come back and to meet again, Whereas you are putting right an action, which is not okay. But the forgiveness is a way to clear it in your heart.
No, I agree with that. I think that that's been one of the dangers of the movement, is that there's not a lot of emphasis on forgiveness. There's a lot of emphasis on accusation and blame, and it's a bit one-sided in that way, not with a karmic view, which most people, again, don't have. I'm not expecting them to have that. But to see that the value in being able to forgive one's offenders is much greater than the value in just simply accusing them. Accuse and then forgive. I mean, say, yes, bring this to light, that this happened, but then have the willingness to say, that you forgive them. Then you are cleaning up the karma in a sense and not creating a similar thing. You've got a very different mindset. But yeah, anyway, I don't want to go too far astray into all these kinds of analyses of things and karmically, but I think it's something to think about. To what extent are we having an effect on others through these types of behaviors? Okay, let's go ahead to the next verse. Whenever unpleasant words arise to our ears, it is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for faults of speech, such as divisive talk and the like. Now we should reproach our errors of speech. So again, speech is one of the main, they talk about 3 doors of our actions. We have the door of the body, the door of speech, and the door of our minds. Of course, our minds are most important, but we're speaking a lot more in many ways, and certainly harming beings a lot more through our speech than what we do through our bodies, or perhaps even through our minds. But, speech is one of the ways that we interrelate with each other. And so if we are disagreeing with others frequently, dividing them through our speech, the traditional ways that negative speech is taught is our speech that is deceptive, lying, where we're deceiving others through our speech that is divisive, that is causing a rift or people to go in separate ways, speech that is harsh, that is causing others to experience some emotion on the basis of the content or the tone of those words, and then speech that is meaningless, that doesn't really have any purpose. That being the least of these. But the other 3 certainly do, harm people by virtue of those patterns. So when we've had put those kinds of words out there, every time we say something in one of those ways, we are essentially creating a karma to have speech return back to us that is unpleasant, or that is in some way the product of our own lying. So it might be deceptive speech, it might be speech that divides us from the people that we're close to, and so on. So anytime we have that kind of thing arising, it's obviously one of the results of having done that ourselves. So now, as it says there, we should reproach our errors of speech, trying to no longer engage in them, and do Tonglen once more, to recognize that all beings receive some manner of bad speech, have things said to them that are painful to hear or unpleasant for them to experience. And so we have to be willing to kind of take on their suffering and give them the happiness, the peace that they want. So I don't know that there's a whole lot there again to say about that one. Everyone is kind of familiar with those 4 patterns of speech. They say the last one, the meaningless speech, they say is the weakest of the 4, but it's the easiest one to engage in, We just like to get caught up in lots of talking about kind of senseless things. We have to connect with others, so we will sometimes talk about stuff that's maybe not that important in the long run. But it's just when you kind of dwell in that, and that becomes like your whole life, just, wasting a lot of time, wasting others' time. All right, let's go on to verse 15. Whenever we are born in any impure place whatsoever, it is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us, for having constantly habituated ourselves with impure appearances, Now we should habituate ourselves with pure appearances alone. So this is another verse that has a little bit of the kind of tantric component to it. Pure and impure can have different meanings in different settings. When we talk about the sutra setting, of course, pure would be when we've had results that are uncontaminated by our delusions, when we've been able to be free from that to some degree. Because we can say that in a sutra presentation, the entire phenomenal world is impure in that sense. It's a product of our own contaminated karma. It's not something created through any kind of wisdom. It's created through, like we saw, one of the results being environmental results. Even the environment that we live in is a product of our own deluded actions. So in this way, even if we have good results in karma, places that appear to be beautiful and so on, they have an impurity by virtue of arising through the force of our contaminated mind. But then in karma, in Tantra, there's another perspective which has to do with this whole idea of what it means for things to be pure in a tantric sense, which means to recognize that even just ordinary appearance has some element of impurity to it, because it's something that we want to abandon on the tantric path. This is why Tantra involves deity yoga being the ability to visualize ourselves in the form of a Buddha. This is why you're given empowerment in Tantra to work with a specific Buddha image, be it Chenrezig or Medicine Buddha or Haruka or Vajrayogini or whoever, all these different beings. You use them as a template to try to see yourself and the world around you in this purified state. That what we have as ordinary appearance is actually, by its very nature, not something that's the ideal, that we want to purify the entire realm by having only those pure appearances. But this correlates very much with the whole idea that I was mentioning earlier about Buddhas and their appearances in this world. That we are dealing with karmic obscurations in our own minds that cause us to only have certain experiences of the Buddhas, of the world around us, and so on. And these karmic appearances often become obstacles for us. There's a story of a Sangha, when a Sangha was meditating on his guru, who he saw as Maitreya Buddha, and he wanted to have this appearance of Maitreya before him. He just kept working on this year after year in a cave. He came out after 3 years, and he has these different visions. I think the first one is something like he sees this bird right outside the cave that has been going in and out of this hole, and through the force of its wings, which are quite soft, it's worn away the rock, so the rock is all smooth. So he thinks, wow, if this bird can do this, just through every day going in and out, then I can put my mind back into meditation and achieve this result. I'll just persevere like the bird persevered in this. So he goes back into the cave and he meditates for another 3 years, and he still has no vision of Maitreya. And so he leaves and he sees something else that shows him, the similar type of thing. He goes back in, he comes after another 3 years, still without a vision of Maitreya. And then he goes back into the cave for his final 12 years of meditation, and he still doesn't have the appearance of Maitreya. And so he goes out of the cave and decides to go down into town this time. And then he happens to spot this dog that's lying on the side of the road that has a bad wound on its hindquarters. It's open, fresh wound, and there are maggots on it from where flies have landed there. And his heart just breaks for this dog, and he just has this moment of compassion that he wants to do something to relieve the suffering of this animal. And so he decides he needs to, kind of repair the wound of this being, but he doesn't want to kill the maggots. So he decides he needs to remove the maggots, and he cuts off a part of his own flesh and holds it ready to put the maggots on, and then he realizes that he can't pick them up because he may crush them. So he decides to pick them up with his tongue. And he goes down with, he has to close his eyes because he just can't stand the thought of putting maggots on his tongue. And then he looks up and there's Maitreya. It suddenly appears, because he got to a point where he had purified his mind through his practice of compassion and so on, that he crossed that little barrier, and voila, there's this amazing being. you know. And of course, he complains to Maitreya. He says, "What took you so long?"
To me, it is. I'm not sure I'm right or wrong. That's why I'm asking. It's not really a question, but a kind of analogy to what you were saying with your Australian friend. Because what I heard about these appearances in connection with Tantra, that appearance is not really important, not really about the appearances as a deity is important, but also divine pride is important.
Sure.
And how I would translate it, and that's what I want to ask, whether it's right or wrong, with your example of the Australian, that in this case, guru and deity in Tantra is the same nature, the same.
Right.
And if with our kind of divine pride, we can put it into pure appearances, like saying, what would Lama Zopa do?
Right.
What would my guru do? And that can create the pure appearance and solve the whole thing of impure place. Because impure place is an impure place. Impure place is in my mind. That was an impure place with this problem with my neighbor.
Yeah.
If I translate it, that what Lama Zopa would do, what if I put myself into this pure appearance, basically practice deity yoga, practice divine pride, what I would do if I were already a deity and try to do this put me, and so, or it's completely wrong.
I don't think it's completely wrong. I don't know, again, I think there's some usefulness in what you're saying. I'm not sure, I'm not getting the full correlation of if you were to practice the way Rinpoche advises, how that's correlated with changing your view. I mean, it is, but I guess, again, when we look at what Tantra's about a deeper, the ability to change our karmic appearance through transforming our minds, through removing ordinary appearance. I mean, ordinary appearance is the main culprit, if you will, in tantric practice. In sutra practice, ordinary appearance is not quite the main culprit. The things that we're trying to get rid of are clinging to true existence, inherent existence, which is part of our understanding in Tantra. That's why we need to have a good understanding of emptiness for it. But in Tantra, there's also this component of we're clinging to an ordinary appearance that we have to see not just the emptiness of, but even the unsatisfactory nature of that, and transcend it by producing a pure appearance of ourselves as the deity. So I just had I'm not sure I'm getting the full gist of how Rinpoche is thinking in that part of it, but I think it's still fine to do that, I don't know. So back on the story of Maitreya, I mean, Maitreya appears and Asanga complains to him, and of course he shows that he actually was there outside the cave the whole time, because he had, I guess Asanga would spit occasionally, when he clear his throat, and Maitreya had all these globs of dried up spit on his robes where Asanga had spit on him. But the story goes from there. I mean, because of his great faith and his perseverance and eventually his deep compassion for this dog, the dog transformed into Maitreya Buddha, and he had that total transformation. He was able to be taken off to, Sukhavati or wherever, and received all these amazing teachings, and I don't know. But so pure appearance, when we go back to the verse and we say, whenever we are born in any impure place whatsoever, Geshe-la says this refers to places that we presently identify as impure, places in which we live where there are many people, such as friends who inflict harm on us, places that are unattractive and so forth. Alternatively, from the point of view of Tantra, it is those places that are considered to be impure due to the appearance of ordinariness and the adherence to that ordinariness that is produced by that. This being the principal maker of impurity, is our own adherence to this unsatisfactory, impure appearance that we have of ourselves in this body, in this world. So this is the result, as he's saying, of all of our own, being habituated with impure appearances, with clinging to those impure appearances. So Tantra is the practice of deity yoga in Tantra is a main antidote to that clinging, to trying to hold on to that, to try to see everything in a pure view. When you're practicing Tantra purely, you're seeing all beings as Buddhas. You're seeing everyone in that enlightened form. You're seeing the entire realm we live in as a celestial abode of all the Buddhas and so on. So it is important to do that to the extent that we can. But even in regard to, the sutra view of just understanding that impure appearances that are problematic and difficult for us, where there's bad smells or where there's a lot of garbage around or whatever the case might be, these kinds of grosser forms of impurity are also ripening of particular karmas, particular actions, where we've, furthered that impurity. I'll share one little bit that Geshe shares and then we'll conclude for today. He says, then think, from now on I will habituate myself with pure appearances with respect to all. The way to do this, moreover, is that whenever it happens, for instance, someone inflicts harm on us, we should train in pure appearances through thinking, since this is the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas displaying themselves in such an aspect for the sake of the bad actions I created, they are extremely kind. And I put a note in the margin on there, maybe Donald Trump is that for us. And that's in America more than here. But you guys have your own Donald Trumps here. Right? Maybe not that bad, but...
Well, Brazil has one now.
Yeah.
Running and
Okay.
looking like it's going to win the elections there.
Yeah. So, we don't know, as I said earlier, who's a Buddha and who isn't. So we can have things appear to us that seem quite impure or that seem like they're not quite what they should be. But we don't know for sure what's all happening. But these are all creations of our own point of view. So our own karma, our own way of looking at things. So this one's a little bit of a strange one in some ways, but it's quite interesting when we look at this idea of impure appearance, particularly from a tantric point of view. So, let me see, maybe there was one thing I could read from Geshe Sopa that might help in regard to this, because there was a note that I'd made on this one. Just 1 second, I'm very close to it, 1:8. It says, therefore, you shouldn't trust your judgments that certain people are good or bad. We should treat all beings with respect and honor as if they were emanations of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. This is cultivating pure vision. By having this attitude even towards someone not worthy of it, you are acting in a wholesome way. So maybe to Andra's point, if we go to the guy in Australia who was, giving the golf balls to that person, if he was also holding a view that maybe this is a Buddha and his next door neighbor and holding that purity, then maybe he would be practicing in that way, trying to abandon the impure appearance of this as kind of an enemy, a harmer. So. All right, well, we didn't make it too far, but we made it far enough, I think, to continue. As I said, I think we can go through a lot of these verses fairly quickly. There's some that require a little more investigation than others. But these verses, as I said earlier, are meant to be meditated on to the degree that we have various experiences that are similar, to engage in that practice of Tonglen as well, to really feel like we're prepared so that when these do arise in our life, we won't hold our ordinary view that we've had that sees them and gets triggered by them and creates the delusions again and all the same patterns that got us in trouble in the first place, but rather we will use them as opportunities to open up our hearts with compassion for others. So let's do just a couple of dedication prayers. Everyone has their prayer book. Let's go to the page 23 at the bottom. And we'll continue on 25 at the top and through the prayer for His Holiness, His long life. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. Through the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. Just as the brave Manjushri and Samantabhadra too realize things as they are, also I dedicate all these merits in the best way, that I may follow their perfect example. I dedicate all these roots of virtue with the dedication praised as the best by the victorious ones thus gone of the 3 times, so that I might perform the noble bodhisattva's deeds. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. So let's also hold thoughts in our hearts for the good health and long lives of our other teachers, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, Geshe Tashi Sering, who was here as your guru, as your Geshe for so many years. All the other teachers that we and others have a karmic connection with. May they all continue to have good health and long lives, and may we and others never be parted from perfect guides in all our lifetimes. Also dedicate for anyone else that you're holding in your heart right now, beings who are experiencing illness or obstacles, who are suffering in any number of ways, including those who have died recently or who are dying at this time. Just send out this positive energy to these beings so that they have their suffering removed and that they have all the causes that will lead them to perfect happiness. In the same way, may all beings find true peace and happiness. Okay, thank you all so much. So we'll continue 10 o'clock. How did lunch work? Was it hour and a half enough? I know tomorrow we won't have the cafe open, so people will have to go somewhere. Do you think do you think we'll need more time for lunch, or no? Hour and a half? Okay.